So good evening and welcome to today's event. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Victor Shih of the University of California, San Diego, where he serves as director of the 21st Century China Center. And I should point out that this is the 25th year, actually, of our ongoing bilateral dialogue and discussion about the state of China's economy and political economy in China writ large, which really began, I think, in Wudao when we were both PhD students at different universities doing dissertations on somewhat interrelated subjects. And one of the reasons I mention that is because it helps, I think, to lay a bit of the context for this evening's discussion, which is that at that time, China's economy was grappling with substantial distortions and imbalances, due in large part to the very large share of non-performing loans that state-owned banks had extended to state-owned enterprises, a subject that both of us were dealing with in our dissertations from different angles. Victor more from the banking side, me more from the enterprise side. And the resolution of that and the ongoing set of issues that have sort of evolved since then really have now come back to a head in a different form all these years later. So in 2008, of course, in the context of the global financial crisis, the economic model that had served China very, very well for about 15 years to deliver extremely high rates of GDP growth based on export-oriented industrialization, export processing manufacturing, and exports in general, really kind of broke in a very substantial way. And it hasn't been fully restored. And maybe cannot or should not be fully restored. In fact, discussions from within the Chinese government as early as 2009, 2010 were saying it's time to move to a new model, a more consumption-driven model, a model based on higher value-added production. Massive stimulus in 2008, 2009 meant that China was the only major economy not to experience recession at that critical time. But the boom or mini boom from that stimulus extended only so far as about 2015, I would say. We could argue about where exactly that dividing line is. And ever since then, there has been an ongoing dilemma, I would say, in Chinese politics about what to do. Is now the time to effect and enact massive structural reforms and a remaking of significant parts of China's economy in order to achieve that new model at the substantial risk of short-term pain in the form of recession or even crisis? Or is it important to engage in another round of some form of stimulus in order to prop up what's there still of a very substantial economy, keep it growing, and hope that it can sort of grow its way out of the distortions and problems within the economy? And so we've seen this come up again very, very recently, within the last month or so, when the Chinese government yet again has opted for a new round of substantial stimulus. So it's in that context that we begin tonight's discussion. And to lead things off, I'd really like to invite Victor to talk pretty much about whatever he likes for a little while, and then we can go back and forth. But I know that you're particularly interested in discussing this issue of regionalism and regional imbalances in the Chinese economy.
Well, no, thank you, Bill, for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming on a cold Friday night. You know, I'm sure there are better places to come than here, so we'll try to make it worth your while. No, I wanted to begin the discussion actually with something that, because what I realize now, just to give people some context, as Bill said, I did my dissertation on banking policies in China. I looked at the resolution of non-performing loans back in sort of the early 2000s. But then in 2009, in the wake of China's stimulus, which they launched in reaction to the global financial crisis, I began to look at local debt and discover that, of course, the stimulus was successful in 2009, 2010 because the Chinese government, on top of the 4 trillion RMB central level debt, also at the local level borrowed additional, 10 plus trillion RMB in debt. Basically, that debt pile at the local level had just grown and grown and grown and grown until today. There's been round after round of attempts to resolve local debt. So what happened actually a couple of weeks ago was not a stimulus. It was another attempt to try to restructure the debt somehow. So then I did another round of data collection. So I did one round of data collection back in 2010. I came up with the first systematic database of local government debt down to the provincial level. It was a report that even some very high-level Chinese government officials, wrote notes to comment on it. It's like, why did this guy figure it out and you guys have no idea what's happening? So it was very harsh commentaries.
Did you see their commentaries?
No, the people told me about it. They're like, the person in charge of finance back then. 批示. More recently, I did another round of data collection, and we can get into how I did it. And then I was able to obtain very fine-grained data on bond debt of all the provinces, as well as the maturity. So then I can figure out exactly when the due dates of all the debt is for different provinces. So that's a very useful source of information. And then once you combine that with, because of course at the provincial level, so the basic calculus is this, right? So provinces, they still collect some taxes on their own. Then they also get transfer payments from the central government to help them pay for expenses. And then the final resource is land sales, right? So we know this, they sell land, property developers buy it, they use it partly to compensate the original landowners. But as you know, this compensation is low, let's just say.
It's basically to generate local revenue. They're dependent on this
Yeah.
for local revenue since 2006.
Yes.
And the reforms that came through then to cancel the agricultural tax and make it harder to collect the so-called extra budgetary fees, right? So this is 70% plus of local government revenue as of even 15 years ago is coming from these land rents or sales of one form or another.
Well, looking at this, it's the equivalent of 7% of local revenue, but because they have to compensate people, some of it, so the net land sales proceeds is not actually that high. But anyway, so China at the local level had a fairly balanced budgetary equilibrium because the sum of local revenue, land sales, and transfer payment was roughly equal to how much money they spent. So from 2010 to, I would say, 2016, there was a fairly stable equilibrium. The problem is, even before COVID, basically local revenue growth and also land sales started to slow down. And then at the same time, there was an accumulation of debt. So many of us know what happens when you rack up some credit card debt. What do you have to do on a monthly basis? You have to pay interest, and it's quite high, right? And then sometimes you pay it back. So there's this concept, debt servicing. Most of you know this. It's the sum of monthly interest plus repayment of principal that's required by your creditor. So the debt servicing gets higher and higher and higher. So when you have the sum of local revenue, land sales, and transfer payment, increasingly you have to subtract from it the annual or monthly debt servicing. And increasingly, the residual of that is far from enough for provinces to spend money. And then either the central government has to give you more transfer payments, so the central government has to somehow collect more taxes, borrow more money, and give it to you, or what has happened is the central government empowers the provinces to borrow even more money, which leads to an even higher accumulation of local debt, and that has been happening. So when you do this calculation of these three fiscal resources minus debt servicing, the big trouble spots turn out to be Tianjin, which we can talk about Tianjin for 5 hours basically. I mean, it's just the fiscal black hole of China. It's like the worst thing ever. Tianjin basically, their debt servicing is 100% of the sum of local revenue, land sales, and transfer payments. So then it's like, how is that even possible? So all the money that they spend comes from new debt. That's the only way that it functions. But then there are other places surprisingly bad, Zhejiang, Jiangsu. So there's basically a high debt belt across the lower part of China. So it starts with Jiangsu, Zhejiang, but then also Hunan, Jiangxi, Guizhou, Yunnan. it turns out it was not the northeastern provinces, which traditionally, and I would love to have your comments on how bad things were in northeastern China back in the day, but nor were they kind of border areas like Tibet and Xinjiang, because they get so much central subsidies that having a little bit of debt, paying some interest is not a problem for them. And it turns out to be these lower middle income. Well, Jiangsu's case, they are high income, but they just borrowed a lot of money.
Zhejiang is high income too.
Zhejiang, well, it's because of political connections. So
Yeah.
they borrow huge amount of money. So once you take out the debt servicing, then they don't have a lot of money left over.
But you have this sort of crescent of debt across southern China.
Yes,
From what you've
it's
just
a
described.
crescent of debt. Well, but what's surprising is that northeastern China did not do that.
Why is that a surprise?
Well, tell me why.
I mean, to
why do
me,
you
it
believe
seems
that?
like less of a surprise for two reasons. First of all, because of what you've alluded to, which is essentially the hollowing out of the northeastern economy from really the mid-1980s all the way up until the 2000s.
Right.
So that's part of it. I mean, so much of what was there, the greatest industrial region in Asia for much of the 20th century, was substantially thinned out, hollowed out over this sort of 25-year period, such that what's left of the economy to spend on is less than what there was at the beginning of that, certainly in relative terms to China's overall economy, and even in some cases in absolute terms. The second thing about the Northeast is that population has not been increasing. In fact, in a lot of cities and localities, and even, I believe, at the provincial level, although I have to remember off the top of my head what the statistics really are, population's been declining for some time across the Northeast. So the number of people that the state has to actually support have been going down. But two other aspects of it also stand out. One is that if you think about subsidies and benefits and transfer payments, right? So the Northeast got sort of the short end of the stick on the transfer payment end after the fiscal reform in 1993, as we both wrote about actually and talked about years ago. But at this point, the Northeast has managed to get a lot more in the form of subsidies and transfer payments than it had been getting. This whole like Zhenxing Dongbei that people talk about, this rejuvenation of the Northeast program over about the last 10 years has actually resulted in some significant payments to provinces and localities to try to make up some of that gap. So the subsidy argument is there a bit. The second issue is the social sort of contract reform of the 1990s and 2000s has resulted in much reduced promises of social aid in the Northeast compared to what there was before, and even compared to other parts of China. So if we look at the level of dibao payments in northeastern locality, dibao is the 最低生活保障, the minimum livelihood guarantee, right? Sort of welfare payments to low-income households. That level is very low in the Northeast compared to those provinces in that crescent of debt.
Just fewer
Relative
people,
to
or
per capita GDP, it's not that there's fewer people, it's that they're paid less.
Okay.
They set this sort of poverty level locally.
Oh, okay.
And in northeastern
Lower.
localities, it's set lower, at least relative to
Right.
per capita GDP in the
Jiangsu,
area. So if you compare, say, Jilin with Guizhou, per capita GDP in Jilin is a lot higher than in Guizhou and has been throughout. So the dibao exact like nominal term payment may be higher in a Jilin locality than a Guizhou locality. But relative to per capita GDP, it's almost certainly lower. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but this happened as a result of those sort of adjustments to the social contract 25, 30, 35 years ago that now have sort of filtered in sort of it's a high poverty region, but it's a region that has low social service costs because the promises of social services and social aid social protection has been hollowed out along with the economy. So that's what I would argue as to why the Northeast is not worse. What I'm curious about why they're not worse, I mean, Tianjin we should talk about actually, it's rather interesting, but Shandong, Henan, Shanxi, those provinces, sort of in an arc bordering
around Beijing.
Tianjin, around Beijing to some extent, Hebei, Shanxi are a little bit better, but Shanxi, Henan, and Shandong, those provinces seem to me like they should be the crisis point provinces. But apparently they're not.
Shanxi is fine because they have a lot of coal. Well, so this is, some of you probably know this. So, China is trying to reduce emission and all that kind of stuff. But still they're building a lot more coal-fired power plants because they're expanding.
But they're not turning them on.
They're not turning them on.
Most of those are make-work projects, I think.
Projects, yeah.
But certainly what the government says they are for is for spare capacity when the sun's not shining or when the wind isn't blowing or when you can't use the renewables. But it looks to me like they're just building them to sort of dig ditches and fill them in again.
Well, but for whatever reason, coal prices have been pretty stable in China the past couple of years. So Shanxi, as a result, as you know, they had this horrendous period of like coal mine consolidation, and all these like smaller mines got killed. It all got consolidated to the state monopolies. But because coal prices have stabilized, the revenue for the province also has been pretty good. Shandong is a bit of a puzzle. So since 2010, it has not engaged in too much debt financing. And I don't know what the reason is, but then very recently, since COVID, they have gotten into a lot of debt in a very short period of time. And again, I don't know why that's the case. Maybe COVID lockdown was longer. I mean, one of the dynamics recently why debt accumulation at the local level really accelerated after COVID was because basically COVID. Well, so in 2020, there was the first half of the year, there was some lockdown in some provinces. When you think about lockdowns, China was very successful. It implemented it. These neighborhood committees went and enforced it. But basically, the result economically is economic death. There's just no economic activity, very little economic activities. So income stops, and also the collection of revenue, such that by the end of that year in 2020, a lot of local governments were in deep trouble, and that was the first year that we saw sizable, extraordinary transfer payments from the central government. So the central government actually announced that, okay, we're going to borrow an extra, 1 to 2 trillion renminbi to transfer at the local level. 2021 was pretty good, but then by 2022, there was another round of lockdown, plus the real estate crackdown. So every year after that, the central government have had to announce extra debt issuance, both at the central and the local level, in order to make sure that local governments have enough money to spend. But then again, there's these geographical patterns, right? So there are some places that are perfectly fine. In fact, their fiscal situation is so good that they have to help the central government to bail out the other provinces.
What provinces are those?
Well, Shanghai.
Shanghai,
Shanghai and Guangdong,
Well, always Shanghai and Guangdong, right? Just like always Tianjin is at the other end. It's like, is this just because they're the richest places?
Yes. Well, and also Shanghai, it's a puzzle, right? Because politically it has been very important. Every senior leader in China since Mao has tried to install their favorite underlings in charge of Shanghai. Xi Jinping's
constituency is still in Shanghai. He's elected from a Shanghai seat to the National People's Congress.
That's true.
So
Officially. No, he's elected by the people of China, all people of China.
Indirectly.
Indirectly.
But directly by members of his constituency in
true.
Shanghai.
Yes. As just party members. You mean his state
NPC.
president?
Yeah,
his state presidency. Yes, that's true. So Shanghai, so usually when you have situations like that where successive leaders install their favorite underling to be in charge of it, usually the place goes to pieces, right? Because his favorite underling is like, well, I am the favorite of so-and-so, so I'm going to just spend...
and this kind of stuff?
A whole... No, in Shanghai... so the...
Chenliangyu.
Chenliangyu, right, exactly.
Okay, but that's back 20 years ago.
Huang Zhi.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Xi Jinping himself was party secretary. But anyway, I think Shanghai still has like its own bureaucracy that's has some autonomy. I mean, what some people in Shanghai told me is that, because we have the extra fiscal resources, we're bailing out the central government left and right, we have some bargaining power. So when they try to tell us to do stuff, to spend like huge amount of money to do this and that, we can kind of say no. We can not outright say no, but say, okay, fine, we'll pay for this, but not that. So that's why Shanghai's deficit is not so bad. I mean, it still is higher than, say, 5 years ago, but it's still by far the best place compared to the rest of China. Guangdong, the other explanation is this. I mean, tell me if you agree with this. So the Chinese government is big. They employ a lot of people. We do know that. But so this is a big burden on places with no people, right? Like Tibet. So Tibet government spending is over 100% of GDP in Tibet. So it's just like, how's that
But
possible?
they get massive subsidies, and they have like 7 million people in a country of 1.5 billion.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so they're
because
tiny. They're this
in
tiny,
Tibet,
yeah.
the government, pretty much is the popular. It's
The
not quite
Qinghai.
the
Qinghai is another
Qinghai is the same thing. Another case like that.
Gansu, I mean, there's a lot.
But then
Neymang.
the opposite also is true, right? So if you have a massive GDP, the government is still relatively effective. I mean, they have all these different departments. Maybe that you need like slightly more cadre. Well, probably need a lot more in public security or whatever. But like for all the other departments like civil affairs and so on and so forth, you still need the same number of people. And paying government's salary really is the biggest cost in the Chinese government because it doesn't have a lot of social welfare program, as we discussed. So therefore, for places like Shanghai and Guangdong that produces a lot of GDP, they don't actually have to spend that much as a share of GDP on government expenses, and therefore they run a pretty high budgetary surplus.
I agree with that up to a point, that argument. I mean, I don't have the data that you have, and I'm curious to see if that argument is really strongly supported by your data. But the logic of that argument rings very much true in the case of Shanghai, less so in Guangdong for me. And the reason is, in Shanghai, you have this very small population relatively. I mean, it is 3 times more people than Tibet, 4 almost times more people than Tibet living in Shanghai. But it's a tiny population compared to the population of Guangdong, right? You're talking about 20 million versus 120 million, right? So it's a very different scale of population there. The other thing is that Shanghai, because it's a city, right? It's a zhixia, it's not actually a province. It has no hinterland. There are poor parts of Guangdong, let's not forget, right? I mean, even urban areas of Guangdong that are poor, let alone rural areas, mountainous areas, and so on. So Guangdong has this huge hinterland that does require social spending in a way that Shanghai does not. 2 other ways that it seems like a little bit of a ripple in your argument. One is that in Shanghai especially, many of those government employees get poached by the private sector. Right? I had a student who wrote about this in the case of judges for his dissertation, where judges in the Shanghai courts are frequently leaving their service as judges and going to be lawyers in private practice in the corporate sector because they can make 4 times the money. And so the response of the Shanghai government has to be to increase salaries quite substantially, such that the official in Shanghai doing the same job as an official just over the border in Kunshan is going to make 2 or 3 times the salary in many cases, just because it's in Shanghai, which means then they're poaching officials from Kunshan and other places, right, to come there. So that's one factor that's odd. The other factor in Guangdong, besides these rural hinterlands and sort of low-income localities, Guangdong is the sort of magnet for migration in China and has been for 30 years at least now, right? So a very large percentage of people in many parts of Guangdong, and actually in the province as a whole, it's quite substantial as well, are actually migrants from either rural areas to cities within the province or actually from other provinces, other parts of China. Many of those migrants actually have been, over the last 20 years, demanding social services and social protection.
But they don't get anything.
They do in Guangdong now, much more so than anywhere else.
Well,
It
the
costs the
firms
government
have
substantial
to,
money.
the firms have to pay Social Security, for the unemployment insurance.
And for migrants, and all kinds of things for migrants get all kinds of social benefits in Guangdong that they don't get in other provinces, at least in some localities.
Well, officially, but in reality, I don't know if they get. Well, no, but
They
even
get
though a
some.
lot of it is paid for by firms, right? It's not the government doesn't have to spend any money on a lot of this stuff.
Even if firms make the eventual payment, the government still has to make the effort to extract that money from firms.
Sure.
And at the scale that we're talking about in Guangdong, it's substantial. My only point is, I think your argument of the sort of small population, big GDP ratio works well in Shanghai from where I sit just logically. In Guangdong, I'm a little bit more ambivalent to jump
So in
on.
Guangdong, if you just look at the tax to GDP ratio, it's like a libertarian's dreamland. I mean, so this is the ironic thing about China as a socialist country, the Communist Party and so on and so forth. Its tax to GDP ratio is better than any country in the world, like Switzerland, whatever libertarian capitalist enclave you can think
Hong
of.
Kong?
Yeah, I actually think it might be.
Is it?
Actually, yeah. No, Guangdong is because it's less than 10% of GDP. So it's like 8% of GDP.
The tax.
The revenue. Well,
Yeah.
so this is okay. Here's a sleight of hand here. Local revenue
Okay.
to GDP ratio. If you include the central revenue, which is value-added tax, it will add to it.
Not
But
just value-added tax, but many other taxes after 93.
yeah, no, but
Value-added tax is a shared tax.
if you then net out from that the rebates, the export rebates,
Okay.
then it's actually maybe at most 15% of GDP, which is still very, very good.
Export rebates plus the transfers back down, the sort of cascade.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like,
At the most, tax rate is like 15% of GDP.
have you calculated all of that with such precision as you
No,
have?
no, I haven't. No, not for the. But Guangdong. I mean, I think there's a reason why all these companies they want to go to Guangdong and stuff. Is because A has huge pool of labor, as you pointed out, and B, like the de facto tax rates, especially if you're export oriented, is actually very low.
Infrastructure also.
And the infrastructure
In
is great,
Guangdong,
and so on and so forth.
Okay, so I have two questions based on some of this. And then if you've got more that you wanted to go into on the regional
Sure,
patterns,
yeah.
by all means. But the first question I have is, what's ultimately backstopping all this debt? Is it the central fisc that's sitting there saying, okay, if Tianjin is the black hole, why doesn't Tianjin go bankrupt? Who's sort of behind that? The second question I have for you is, what about COVID? Because you kind of alluded to that, but I
Yeah.
mean, COVID entailed massive debt spending in every country. I mean, not least the UK, the US, all kinds of other countries, but in China as well. So what did COVID do to sort of rejig this picture, if anything?
Yeah. Well, so as many of you know, there's this literature on local debt in even in political science, like these, Jonathan Rodden, people like that. So the traditional setup for this phenomenon is that local government, because it is just a part of a country, they engage in free riding. So they basically think that, we can just get into a lot of debt, and then the central government is going to come and bail us out. And then, the central government's ability to bail them out, however, is constrained, and it's constrained by the financial market. So usually there are like these global creditors, your capitalists from New York and so on and so forth. They will constrain, like, if some province of Brazil wants to get into a lot of debt, immediately some hedge fund person in New York will say, oh, this is bad for the overall fiscal balance of Brazil. We're going to sell bonds issued by the Brazilian government. The interest rates go up. And that is a constraint on the extent to which some province in Brazil can get into debt. The problem in China is that there's very little external debt. And all the debt, both issued by the local governments and the central government, they're held by domestic banks. More so, they're domestic banks owned by the Chinese government. So in a sense, the Chinese government is both the debtor and the creditor. And I think this is fundamentally, when you look at the financial institutions and the whole fiscal system, that is the reason that enables both the local government and the central government to get into so much debt, because at the end of the day, the left hand is giving to the right hand. It doesn't really matter. No one's saying no. It's all moreover, the government, as we all know, is strictly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party being a strictly hierarchical organization, so everyone listens to one boss, especially now.
So this is basically the revenge of Janos Kornai and soft budget constraints for the 21st century.
Exactly.
So they never overcame that problem, is what you're saying, basically. This is the same as the non-performing loans in the 1990s.
What's interesting is there was a period to try to do. I mean, so what Zhongji did, when we were in grad school, Zhongji was carrying out all this reform. The whole argument for northeastern China, I think, was like, wow, if you get into all this debt, then the banks will be undercapitalized, and increasingly, foreign investors are part of shareholders, and then they'll, tell the banks to stop it.
But the solution then was to take the debt off of the banks with the asset management corporations that were under the State Assets Commission, right? So they would take the debt off of the banks. And then put it under these state-run
But
state-owned
then they
firms.
listed the banks to introduce global capitalists.
Yeah, it's about 2003, but that was
yes.
after they'd cleared all the non-performing
Yes,
loans
yes,
off
yes.
the bank's
Yeah,
balance sheets, right? So that the problem now, who's going to clear that balance sheet and how?
Well, there are still some global investors. So if you all want to buy some shares of China Construction Bank, you can go push a button. I don't recommend it. I don't make any recommendations on investment in general. Yeah, exactly. Well, no, I don't. I mean, I'm not the only one saying that. I mean, it's just look at how the stock market of China performed today, and you'll have the answer. So even though the introduction of global capitalists, they held minority shares, they for a while actually had some constraining influence on the behavior of Chinese banking sector, which in the recent 3 years, because of COVID, because of the perceived and some of real pressure from the U.S. government against China, against the Chinese economy, a lot of the constraints on the Chinese banks have been removed. Either through direct regulations or de facto.
Has that really only happened since COVID, though?
Yeah. So one thing that's, like, for example, so especially after the housing crash, which we haven't talked about yet.
No, we haven't.
But basically, as many of you know, 2022, these very harsh. So Chinese property companies were borrowing a lot of money in a very irresponsible way in some cases. Somehow, Xi Jinping thought that it was a good time to crack down on that phenomenon in the middle of like the worst public health crisis China has faced for, since 1949. When COVID reemerged in 2022, that also was when he cracked down on real estate. For the life of me, I don't know why.
Well, but it's of a piece, I think, with the earlier crackdown on e-commerce and the VIE holding structure of e-commerce and technology companies that happened in late 2020. Right, so COVID begins, you're in the middle of this crisis, and you have one crackdown and then another on the very two sectors that were actually thriving before COVID, which, from the point of view of trying to grow the economy doesn't make sense, but I think that suggests quite powerfully there was a different rationale. But in the case of
regardless, when that was rolled out, the real estate market just crashed. People stopped buying, then property developers stopped buying land. And then there's all these like empty apartments all over China. I mean, there were always all these empty apartments all over China, but at least people bought them, as speculative investment. Some of it, well, except for in Tianjin.
And ghost cities. I mean,
Ordos, yeah. So
not only Ordos, there are ghost cities and ghost districts all over China. I published an article about that in 2016.
Yeah.
And that was based on research we did, 4 years before that. So, it's not like there haven't been any ghost cities.
Sure.
Up until COVID.
But not like all of a sudden, many places appearing. So then a lot of the regulations rolled out in the early 2000s to 2010 began to get rolled back, right? So this whole idea, so for example, the shadow banking, wealth management products, you can't pool them all together to lend to, different property developers. That was basically put on hold. A lot of the wealth management products that was based on multiple loans as underlying assets, they were allowed to roll over and over again. And then there was this very astonishing regulation in 2023, actually it came out. Basically, a local government, which is no longer supposed to borrow additional money, they can form an entity to borrow money to buy empty apartments to serve as welfare housing. So 保障房, right?
保障房,
yeah, 保障房. Yeah. So, but then it's like,
福利房
what is the demand for 保障房? Maybe you probably know more about this than.
It depends. It depends where and depends who.
Well, it's supposed to be all over China, and then PBOC is supporting some of these purchases.
Yeah.
But
it's not going to.
Basically, it is the PBOC printing money and then lending it to banks.
PBOC is the People's Bank of China.
Yeah, the Central Bank
Reserve Bank
is printing money to buy up empty apartments in China, basically. But is there real demand? Because the notional things are, we can lend money to local governments to buy up these empty apartments because these poor workers are going to live in there. They'll pay low rent, but they'll still pay some kind of rent. And the rent is going to allow the interest payments to happen.
No, I think it really depends where. And I think it really depends on the scale. I have not followed this program very carefully. One other question I wanted to ask you was about the timing of this crisis in the banking sector, or this sort of return to soft budget constraints in the banking sector. I would have, as a non-expert on banks, right? You actually studied banks, I don't. But I would have pegged it more about 2008, when the sort of policy-directed massive lending to stimulate the economy and engage in infrastructure and other spending in the context of the financial crisis. And it just seems like it gets worse and worse from there. So it's not even just COVID, it's even earlier. But in terms of these Baozhangfang or sort of new iteration of what used to be called Fulifang that would be given to you by your work unit, it seems to me that the demand for those is going to vary rather substantially by locality, that in some places there would be substantial demand and in many places not. The other thing would be that from what I've heard of that program, and as I said, I haven't really followed it that closely, the amount of capital being put into it by the state is a tiny, tiny, tiny drop in the bucket.
Yes,
I mean,
it's all borrowed money. Yeah.
It's a tiny fraction of 1% of the overhang of the real estate market. By some reports that I've heard, there's something like 4 or 5 apartments now for every single person in China. It really has just been an incredible overbuilding, and overbuilding that has not been sort of allocatively efficient either. They're being built in the wrong places and at the wrong sort of apartments, too big, too small, wrong cities, et cetera, for where the demand actually is. So that's one issue. The other little comment on that I wonder if it's true. I mean, you and I are both fairly familiar to different degrees and in different ways with Hong Kong and Singapore, that both adopted a model that was originally sort of linked to what was rolled out by the administration of Governor Alexander Grantham in the 1950s in Hong Kong after the massive fire in the slums in Shijiawei, Shekip-Mei, right? That the Housing Development Board and the Housing Development Board in Hong Kong and then again in Singapore as a sort of government-sponsored system to build housing, first to requisition land, to derive land rent and sort of land arbitrage this way, then to build housing, allocate that housing to people who need it, right? And a very high percentage of people in both Hong Kong and Singapore ended up living in public housing, and then to give people a sort of right to buy over either a short-term or long-term that housing that had been given to them in which to live. And in both Hong Kong and Singapore, this has been a phenomenally successful program. So I wonder to some extent, to the extent that Chinese officials are pushing this now as a way to address the housing bubble, maybe they're thinking they could do something like a housing development board, but with the ready-made housing. They've already skipped the first couple of steps. They don't have to requisition the land. That's already been done. The land revenue's already been calculated. The housing's already been built. All they now have to do is give it to people and give them right to buy.
Yeah, well, as you said, in places where there's a net increase in migrant workers, and if you do indeed give these units to migrant workers at a price that is cheap enough for them, then it makes sense.
Migrant workers are the children of laid-off workers who now want to get married and don't have a house.
Want to get married. Well,
If
yes.
you're the
But
child
if
of a laid-off
everyone is
worker,
given the free unit, I don't know whether that helps you in the marriage market or not. Because it's like all the other poor guys
Well.
who also get a free flat. I don't know.
well, but at least
Anyway,
everybody's
that
got
gets
a
very
flat.
complicated.
Yeah.
For the recording, we won't now go down that rabbit hole. No, so but let's say this would work in Shanghai and Guangzhou and a few places. It won't. I mean, like for cities with a net decrease, like for example, if there's a bunch of welfare housing in Changchun or something like that, I mean, like who's going to rent it?
Oh, I think there would be people who would
be
want it.
Okay.
As I said, for example, there are lots of people. I mean, Changchun is not such a
It's not so bad.
case city
No, yeah,
compared to
the
some.
car industries.
But there are a lot of people in industrial cities, big industrial cities like that, and smaller ones, who, for example, are the children of laid-off workers, who do not have a lot of family wealth, who cannot find a really high-paying job locally, but who would very much like to have a house. I'm sure there are people who would appreciate the offer of housing in those places.
Sure.
But
it's not
where
free,
I'd be
though.
concerned
But it's
would
not
be,
free. That's
yeah,
the-
but the issue would be not so much in those kind of big cities or industrial cities. The issue I would see is if you take a train across China, you'll see in the middle of the field, rising up from the horizon, tower blocks of 20 or 30 stories of empty flats. Who's going to go to those? Who's going to want those? Every village that's been sort of urbanized by fiat after 2011, right? And all of these hundreds of millions of people who suddenly received, the Fei Nong Hukou immediately by administrative decree. Who's going to buy places in those localities that had been rural and now are suddenly urbanized and overbuilt.
Well, but in some places, the government just tells civil servants they have to buy in certain places.
Yeah, to go back to Ordos, that's exactly
Yeah,
what
Ordos,
happened
that's
there.
what happened,
They created this new city called Kangbashi
Yeah.
in Inner Mongolia next to Ordos. For the first 10 years of its existence, was used only for skateboarding films and a rather dubious beauty pageant, I think owned by Donald Trump. Otherwise,
Really?
yes,
No, come
yes,
on.
there was some kind of crazy beauty pageant held there in
great.
like 2009. It's a whole city. It's a city roughly the size of Chicago, slightly larger than Manchester or Birmingham, with no one in it. Literally no one in it. Built for 3 million people. There's nothing there, at least as of the first 8 to 10 years that it had been in existence. It was built with money from a coal and rare earths boom in the locality, and the locality decided what we need to do is build a whole new city, and they forced all the government officials then to move there. They said, you must live there. They moved all the government offices there. They said, you must live there. By the way, Indonesia is now experiencing this with Nusantara, the new capital,
yeah, the new capital.
in Kalimantan. But they forced all the government officials to move there. The government officials did go there, and then they would go somewhere else on the weekend, or whenever they had time away
They go
from
back
work.
to their real home.
They
which
go
is in
back
the
to
old
in the
downtown,
old
yeah.
downtown, or they sometimes, if they could actually work it out, if they got subsidies on that as well, they would buy another house in Beijing, and they'd go to Beijing every weekend. They wouldn't even be in the locality, right? So they'd be.
Yeah.
So you find this happening frequently. That kind of compulsory purchase doesn't necessarily work. But to return to a different theme, what is the real impact of COVID then on all of this debt?
So there's some very good research done by Scott Rosell that has come out. I urge you to look at it. Basically, for a lot of migrant workers, because of the lockdown, they couldn't work, they couldn't earn salary. Their savings, which already was not high to begin with, very meager, got wiped out. Most people in China did not receive direct transfer payments as we in the U.S. did, or people in the U.K. did. So when their salary stopped coming, they had to spend down the savings. And this is, I think, the key reason why, even though parts of the Chinese economy is on the way of recovery, especially the export sector is actually doing okay, still you don't see consumption picking up in too strong of a way, is because people, for the majority of households, their saving is down substantially or has gone to zero. And so even if they're making a salary, they don't dare to spend too much money because they don't know if the economy is going to worsen. And then that, of course, reinforces an expectation of slow growth, deflation, which makes people even less willing to spend money. The government, so that's, I think, it's the biggest impact by far. I mean, there was some positive impact for the Chinese economy in that I think Chinese companies grabbed an even larger share of the global supply chain.
Well, for PPE and COVID tests and all this kind of thing.
For EVs, for all
yeah,
kinds
well,
of
yes,
stuff,
okay.
Because
But that's EVs and COVID,
it's
really?
it's not because,
I don't see that
maybe
relationship.
a little bit because of COVID, because basically a lot of factories in the U.S. and to lesser extent in other countries, they just did not operate for months at a time. For China, even with the lockdown, even with COVID spreading in a very uncontrollable way in 2022, most of the factories were running nonstop.
Yeah, there were a lot of labor issues
Very high.
around this,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
labor
So they
regulation,
used all kinds of
enforcement
crazy
issues around
policies to make sure that it happened, but it was successful because the industrial economy hummed. And so Chinese companies could use, it's those guys can't sell to you because they're not in operation. We can sell to you. And then people use some of these parts and batteries and whatnot and say, hey, well, actually, it's not bad. And it's cheaper than what I was paying. It's why shouldn't I be buying this Chinese stuff? So maybe that was
Are you
it's a
confident in
smaller,
that?
well, no, it's a small effect.
yeah.
It's a small effect.
Because it seems like the EV arc is a long one, from what I can
it's a
see.
long one. Yes.
And then B, this argument about the Chinese factories are working, the foreign ones are not. I mean, the rest of the world moved on from COVID pretty fast. by late 2021, early 2022,
Yes.
most of the world was economically speaking more or less back to normal levels of activity. China was not. And by some levels, by some measures, still is not.
Statistics like industrial output as a share of GDP is like permanently down in several, especially in
Yes.
Europe, like several
Yes.
European economies.
Well,
I
if
don't
we're
know
talking
why
about
that's
industry
the
versus
case.
services,
Yeah.
definitely the impact in China is worse and longer in services.
Right.
Whereas you could argue that there's more of an impact in manufacturing in other countries, although I'm not even confident of that.
Right. It could be it could be just because in China the services is down, so that industry,
Yeah.
permanently
exactly.
became like a
Exactly.
higher
Exactly.
proportion of GDP. So
Because
yeah,
services
that
are
could be the
clearly
case,
way
yeah.
down. I mean, even just anecdotally.
Way
so
down,
that's
way
clear.
down. Yeah, in China. Yeah. So well, how
what
should
about-
the Chinese government fix everything then?
Yeah.
No.
What do you think?
Well, okay. Tell me, back in the so you had this whole thing about regionalism and like the impact of SOE reform on the workers. So Shanghai was a success case, but were there northeastern provinces that dealt with the issue sort of okay, even though they didn't have a lot of money?
Well, I mean, there's only 3 northeastern provinces.
Yeah.
And the problem is not confined to the Northeast, right? The highest rate of layoffs in terms of that specific issue was in fact in Shanghai, right? It was a success story because they were able
Well, they had
to.
a lot of money.
Yeah, so they were able to basically give subsidies and social protection to laid off workers.
Yeah.
And they had booming industries other than the state
Other
sector.
than state sector.
Right, that were actually absorbing new entrants into the labor market and adding to the local fiscal take, whereas in many other places they were not. The Northeast actually in some ways was not the worst case in terms of having inadequate resources to address the problem or necessarily reemployment outcomes, depending on exactly where. I mean, the sort of central areas, and by an area that I would call the middle to upper reaches of the Changjiang River. So basically Hunan, Chongqing, Hubei, Sichuan, that area was really in many ways the hardest hit, even worse than the Northeast, because the rate of layoffs was very high. The per capita income was quite low, even comparatively to the Northeast. And they had another issue. State-owned enterprises in those regions were concentrated in 2 kinds of localities. Giant cities, like Chongqing, or third front development areas that in the 1960s and 70s, or mountainous areas even, sort of places that were built up for putting defense plants, far away from the coast and far away from the northern border. And so in third front cities, there's really nothing else going.
Yeah.
I mean, you think an industrial town in the Northeast is bad. Some of the third front places are really, devoid of other opportunities for any kind of development. So if the SOE goes badly there, everything's going to go badly. In the big cities, there was another issue, which is that migrant workers came there. There were hardly any migrant workers in the main northeastern city where I was doing that fieldwork in Benxi in Liaoning province. Right? There were hardly any migrant workers going in. In fact, people were migrating out to go look for work somewhere else. There were no jobs there that weren't attracting any migrant workers. Whereas a place like Chongqing or Wuhan, they attracted a lot of migrant workers. And the migrants could compete with the laid off workers for jobs, such that because the migrants didn't have to use the cash income from that employment to feed their families. Right? They had land back in the village. Their family was living off of that land to subsist. It effectively amounted to a kind of aid in wages, like what Polanyi characterized in the Spieneman Poor Law in the UK, such that they could compete for jobs at wages that were effectively below subsistence. And laid off workers could not. And so that really made things very, very difficult there. And the largest absolute number of laid off workers was in fact in that sort of middle to upper Changjiang region. Rather than in the Northeast, because the population is higher in those provinces. People forget that all the time. And the highest rate of layoffs was in Shanghai and the region I would call the Central Coast, basically from Tianjin down to Shanghai, encompassing sort of peninsular Shandong and Jiangsu province as well. So the Northeast is not necessarily the basket case. At the provincial level, no Northeastern province handled that situation well. All of them eventually ended up, as I was saying earlier, with this kind of reduced or hollowed out, reduced headcount, but also kind of hollowed out social contract, such that the benefits and social protection promise was way down from where it had been before. And much worse economic situation in both absolute and relative terms than there have been earlier. On top of that, they have more recently received huge subsidies, starting from about 2008. And so that shift in sort of expectations and baseline plus this aid has meant that the Northeast is nowhere near as badly off as it was before. And that's why I think you're not seeing these huge levels of debt there that you're seeing elsewhere.
Well, so is the lesson then, I guess the one good thing about China is the labor market is pretty fluid. So that if you
Good unless you're a
really
worker, yeah.
don't have a job, there are no social services in one locality, you can hop on a high-speed train and try to go to Shanghai and deliver groceries for people. I mean, is that the solution? Basically, it's like, yeah, it really, there's this debt belt from Jiangsu all the way down to Yunnan. It sucks in these provinces, hop on a high-speed railroad train, tickets are cheap, go to Shanghai and start delivering stuff.
So this is like the Meituan to the rescue.
Yeah,
basically.
Meituan to rescue.
that
Is that the solution?
I hope not.
You
That's a
hope
pretty bad solution.
That's a very
I mean,
efficient one.
Maybe, but I mean, the implication of that is you're going to tell about 350 million people across all these vast provinces to go
That's true,
to
yeah.
a couple of cities to deliver food.
Yeah.
That doesn't really make sense.
But yeah, exactly, because then the prices get, well, but de facto, that's what's happening. Like the reason why like these delivery people, they're going crazy and like start killing people is because companies are able to impose these really harsh conditions on them. It's like, oh, you must deliver this in, within 10 minutes or we dock your wages and so on and so forth. They're able to do it because the supply of delivery people is massive because all these places not doing well, they all flood into, the few cities that are doing well and resulting in a huge oversupply of labor force.
Well, this is my last question to you, and then I want your answer to the question
Okay,
of what the
yeah.
Chinese government should do, because
Yeah,
I actually
yeah.
didn't, I noticed I ducked answering that question of what they should do, and I just answered your earlier question about the Northeast. But the other thing I was going to ask you was, is there a correlation? And I don't think there is. So the question really is, why is there not a stronger correlation between how healthy the economy is in a particular place and the levels of debt that those local governments are running? I mean, I cannot believe, for example, that Jiangsu is an unhealthy province economically, or a poor province, or a high unemployment province. It just isn't. Right? It's one of the richest, most successful provinces in the country.
Places,
By many measures, much better than Guangdong,
yeah.
even that we were discussing earlier. So, why is there not a stronger correlation, basically, between the health of the economy and the levels of local government debt?
Well, I think we are still seeing it play out. But you're right. Like, so Zhejiang is a good example of this. Where
also a rich and successful
the economy is very healthy, has tech sector, has a huge export sector, but I think mostly because of political connections that it has enjoyed, because Xi Jinping, was party secretary there. Local governments there have gotten into a huge amount of debt in the past 10 years. Had relatively low debt rate compared to GDP 10 years ago. Now is like this really high proportion, sort of 50-60%.
But to take two neighboring places to Zhejiang, Xi Jinping also has very extensive political experience in Fujian and in Shanghai. And we've just talked about Shanghai as a paragon of great management, and Fujian is not
he's
in
only
your
there for
market
1
debt,
year,
isn't it?
and then besides him.
But Fujian, he was there for a long time.
Yeah, that's true.
And Fujian is not in your debt.
Fujian is not in great shape, but it's
No.
not as dismal as Jiangsu and Zhejiang. But it's not in great shape. I mean, it's like medium bad, I guess I would say. But then what happens, what you see in the economy is that there's high amount of debt. They have to service it. There are all these like empty buildings. There are a lot of empty
Fujian
buildings.
or in Zhejiang?
In Zhejiang,
Yeah.
in Jiangsu, because there are smaller cities, or even in big cities, as there's like 100, Kaifachi, like these industrial zones around
Even in
the
Hangzhou,
core
if we're
downtown.
going to talk about
Exactly.
Zhejiang, yeah.
And then you go to one of these industrial zones, like mostly empty, and so on and so forth. So you have that part, but at the same, so what the puzzle is, why don't these highly indebted provinces tax the companies more to help service the debt? They haven't done it to such an extent up to this point. I think part of the reason is because they're able to, they still have enough good assets to leverage. They're able to borrow money as a way to roll over a lot of existing debt. They don't have to engage in too much predatory behavior, which is impose random fines on companies and stuff. So in some of the debt belt provinces, like Guizhou and places like that,
Yunnan.
they are randomly fining enterprises. There was this case, actually, a very famous economist in China told me this horrendous story. So this guy, so it's both kind of a horrendous and good story, just from an American perspective. So this guy steals American semiconductor technology, right? So he steals it, goes back to China and say, aha, I'm gonna start a semiconductor company in China, and it's gonna be great. So
In Guizhou?
In Yunnan.
In Yunnan, okay.
So the Yunnan government's like, very great, just come over here, we'll give you all the subsidies, free loans, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. So he does it, so he goes to Yunnan, he starts a company, and it starts to build up. When it was about to start producing chips, the Yunnan government went to him and say, look, we gave you everything, we're gonna take this company from you. And this guy's like, no, I'm gonna fight it, and next thing you know, he gets arrested. Not by the US government, but by the Chinese government.
Or by the local authorities in
By the local authorities.
or wherever he was.
So
with his
then
company.
he was like, oh my God, the central government has to save me because all these policies are supposed to help semiconductor industry and so on and so forth. So he writes all these letters to Ministry of Information and Industry. They do nothing. They're like, sorry, you got arrested by the police.
What was he arrested for?
By, whatever, some trumped up charge. It's like, oh, you didn't pay taxes. It's like, yeah, but you told me I didn't have to pay taxes. That's why I came. It's like, so it was an interesting story. But obviously, if this guy had gone to Jiangsu, he probably wouldn't have received as many subsidies. But also, that would not have happened to him in Jiangsu because Jiangsu government doesn't have to do stuff like that, by and large. I would say. So there is this variation in predatory behavior, which is very understudied. There's not a lot of data. We know it's happening. It's one of the consequences of high debt in some regions.
That's really interesting, and it dovetails with another sort of pet topic of mine, which is the criminalization of civil disputes in the legal system. And it would be really interesting to trace this out across your debt arc. And to see if basically the eastern parts of your debt arc, which are much wealthier and much healthier in terms of most measures of governance, are less susceptible to this than the western parts of your debt arc, which are much poorer and much more susceptible to governance problems, one would think. I don't know if that will, you haven't tested that, I guess. Or you
No,
don't
well, I guess it's possible because like
data
these
will be hard.
court case data.
That's all disappearing now.
Well, I know, but there's historical data.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, there's some, but only very recent. So before I open up to questions, which I'm really, really eager to do, I do want to see if you can answer that question.
Okay,
What should the
what
Chinese
should
government
the
do
government
right now to fix all this mess?
Okay, so when the 6 trillion renminbi rumors started circulating on Reuters, I'm like, this is great. Where they can really help the Chinese economy is if the central government had issued the 6 trillion renminbi in debt and used it all to repay wage arrears in Chinese government agencies at the local level, in all the Shih Danwei, all the schools and hospitals, and all the vendors who have serviced Chinese government, local Chinese government, and have not been paid. If there's a massive repayment of wages and account receivables at the firm level, that really would have helped the government.
Would help consumption.
And therefore help the economy. Because as you know, in a lot of small and medium cities, the middle class are people who work for the Chinese government.
Directly or indirectly?
Directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
And when they spend
Vendors,
money again, then the economy in these places will improve.
And as you also pointed out, even just in passing, there is a massive problem of people not being paid. by local
Yes,
governments,
yes.
both direct
Wage arrears,
employees,
yeah.
wage arrears, but also particularly these vendors and contractors
vendors, yeah.
who just been stiffed massively for years.
Massive. So I think that would have been the best use. And then like over time, I was like, oh well, even if they use a third of the money, that would be good. Or like even if they use a tenth of the money for that, that would be even good. Then in the end, they used nothing. It was just an accounting exercise. Like, oh, we're gonna issue new local government debt to repay existing local government debt.
Right.
So it's like, in effect, there's no impact on the economy.
Okay, well, let's open up to questions. We'll take a bank of questions, if that's okay, and then try to answer them. We have about almost 30 minutes, so we have time for a number of questions. Let's go with Xin, Connor, and Hugo in that order.
So this is really, thank you for the wonderful, yeah. Thank you for the interesting dialogue. Right? I'm a historian, so I know very little about the topic. I learned a lot. But then I have a question. I'm not sure if you can help me to answer. Because I remember a couple of years ago in the United States, there was this conversation about quantitative easing. That's probably end of the Obama era. I don't remember. And then somehow that conversation disappeared, at least to me, right? And then when I was listening to this conversation, somehow it seems familiar, right? But then you never used the word quantitative easing on China. So I wonder what is the reason for that? Maybe it's a different concept. It doesn't apply to China? Or it's a different situation?
Should I answer? I mean, it's kind of a technical thing.
Yeah,
Should
I mean,
I-
we should take the other two questions, but
Yeah,
you
let me
can answer
let me
very
just
quickly.
answer very quickly. So QE is when the central bank expand its balance sheets and lend money to the government for fiscal expenditure, or for other policy reasons. So China, the central bank in China, PBOC, they have tried to refrain from doing that. So the U.S. did it because there was a huge pile of bad debt in the banking system. So there was QE to buy up all this garbage and put it on the central bank's balance sheets. That was how the U.S. Basically survived the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Now there's like quantitative tightening, right? As the Fed began to sell off some of these assets. So China, because it has fixed exchange rates and close capital account, the PBOC was always afraid that if they engage in outright quantitative easing, people in China will think that there's like unlimited money printing, and they'll try to get the money out of China. So there already is a lot of money flowing out of China all the time. They're afraid that quantitative easing would accelerate that process. Recently, however, the central budget, the local budget is just completely exhausted, you would say. So the central bank signaled, I think a few months ago, that they would begin being more active on the bond market. So they didn't call it quantitative easing, they called it active intervention in the bond market. In reality, they're buying more and more bonds issued by the government, issued by other state-owned entities as a way to finance the rollover of this huge amount of debt. So it is starting to happen in China.
I just had a quick question about the linkage of this issue with the Belt and Road Initiative. I just wanted to ask, from my understanding at least, Chinese SOEs and development banks have been very reticent to provide debt relief or even rescheduling in the case of, for example, the Common Framework or other multilateral initiatives. Is there a relationship here that's relevant, or is this quite a discrete issue? My other kind of tangential question was just in terms of the discussion, which thanks, it was really brilliant and fascinating. From my understanding, at least, in the kind of FT style reporting, the general take was the previous stimulus was too minimal. But I haven't been able to trace, like, so what exactly, is it just purely what you described, like an irresolvable problem of local debt, or is there some unwillingness to transition to a different model that would allow for that sort of consumption-led growth? It can be quite difficult to pass through those debates. Thanks.
A very short question. Thank you both so much. In a lot of your analysis and calculations, you were relying on GDP statistics at a province level and at a national level. How comfortable are we trusting those GDP statistics? And how confident are we in the provincial and central Chinese government that it is accurately reporting those GDP statistics on which we can then draw these conclusions?
Well, let me speak to that last question, and then I'll let you speak to the Belt and Road, and then we can both talk about all of this, and then we can also take more questions, hopefully from this side of the room as well. So, in terms of the reliability of Chinese statistics, and you can speak to this as well if you like. Yes, there are problems with them. There was a time, say 30 years ago, where every locality almost was reporting a local GDP growth rate that was higher than the national average. So every place was sort of Lake Wobegon or whatever, and they all had above average growth rates. So obviously that calls into question quite clearly how reliable these publicly reported statistics are. It was also the case, say 25 years ago, that central government officials didn't know what the situation was in the economy or society very well in a lot of localities, because the reports that were being fed up to them internally were even more flawed sometimes than the publicly reported data. So yes, there are significant problems with many Chinese statistics. But that said, two factors. One, they're not atrocious relative to a lot of other countries in the world, relative to how bad they could be. Chinese statistics are actually reasonably good. There's some very competent and committed people working hard on gathering them. They are much, much better than they could be in terms of being off. And it's often possible, if we think they're off, that we can sort of compensate with assume it's a systematic error in a particular direction and compensate a bit. For example, everybody wants higher, not lower GDP numbers, right? So you can sort of deflate all of them. The second thing is that they're getting a lot better. Like all of those stories I'm telling you in response to this question are from decades ago, right? And over the last several decades, it really has gotten quite a bit better. Does that mean they're perfect? Absolutely not. Does that mean that we have to take a lot of this with a grain of salt? Yes, but they're not as bad as they could be, and they are getting better, I would say, in terms of reliability. Would you agree or would you disagree?
GDP, so the nominal GDP collection is pretty good. The problem is like real GDP growth is highly manipulated. The way they, this is a story I heard from like an NBS person. So as you know, like pork, it's like a most common meat. So one feature of pork prices is highly volatile, right? So it moves up by a lot, moves down a lot. So the trick is all you have to do is to change the weighting of pork in the CPI calculation.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's 2%, sometimes it's 1%. So let's say pork prices went up by a lot. If you want to go from deflation to slight inflation, you just increase the weighting on pork, and it will get you out of deflation, get you into slight positive inflation, and that will also, of course, affect your GDP calculation, your real GDP calculation.
Well, but some of this, I mean, not that, but some weighting manipulation could be defensible from the angle of saying, okay, if pork prices have skyrocketed,
then of course
maybe people will eat less pork, and instead they'll eat more, beef or fish or chicken or vegetables, and maybe those prices. So if we're going to have a basket of goods on which we calculate CPI and we're going to weight them differently.
That's not what they say. It's like, well, if they want growth at this level, then we change the pork.
No, this kind of ex post manipulation. Yeah, absolutely. That's why you look at, so obviously these ratios you calculate, debt to GDP ratio, it's not going to be perfect, there's some deviation, but it's just the debt is rising so fast that it doesn't really change it very much, right? So when your debt level increases by 50% over the course of 3 years, GDP might be off a little bit, a couple percentage up or down or whatever, but the ratio will still be mostly the same. So on One Belt, One Road, it is kind of connected in conjunction with US dollar interest rates. So basically, as you know, China was very generous, lent a lot of money in 2013, 2014, 2015 to other countries. That was also out of two considerations. One was that dollar interest rate was very low, so they wanted to diversify into something that was higher yielding. Then the other thing was they wanted to decrease the concentration of U.S. Treasury in the portfolio of the foreign exchange reserve. So then they diversified into loans to all these, developing countries. The problem with that approach is that,
today this has become a big problem, which is that when you lend to countries that grow less than the U.S. and are poorer than the U.S., they're not going to repay you. So that's a problem. And also, on top of being able to repay you, up to this point at least, the U.S. offers a higher interest rates, than before. So it's actually very attractive. You buy some U.S. Treasury, 4%. I am buying some U.S. Treasury, and I hate doing that. No, so
Again, you are being recorded.
well, it's fine. I can say about U.S.
No,
Treasury
yeah,
all I
well,
want.
for
Now, especially when Trump is in charge. Basically, and on top of that is even when, let's say you lend to some country in Latin America and Africa or whatever, it has a set duration. And when the loan matures, sometimes you can't get your money back. You have to extend the maturity. So this is what we call highly illiquid assets. And basically, when you have a foreign exchange reserve and when there's a lot of pressure for people to move money out of China, you want your reserve to be highly liquid. And besides bonds issued by the EU, the UK, Japan, and the US, you really don't have a lot of other options at that scale. The scale is $3+ trillion US dollars. So basically, with high interest rates, so if China wants to get into another round of lending to developing countries, they really can't take even more money from the foreign exchange reserve to lend to countries. That would be irresponsible. What they have to do is to borrow at 4 or 5% in the global capital market and then lend to their debtors at 6 to 7%, which most countries cannot afford.
Let me say something else, though, about Belt and Road. I agree with what you said, but I think there's another angle to this, which is important. One is that, the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road program, really starts in 2012, 2013. It ends basically in 2022. There was no mention of it at the 20th Party Congress at all, as far as I can recall. Maybe it was buried somewhere in the government work report, but it was essentially not mentioned. That's a big shift. And the reasons for that shift, I think, are multifaceted. What I would also say before starting into the next point on Belt and Road is that it does continue, especially in a couple of countries, Indonesia and Pakistan. It continues in those countries for very different reasons. In Indonesia, a very significant portion of the One Belt, One Road investment is going into mining, and mining especially of nickel, allegedly for batteries and electric vehicle parts, really for making stainless steel in many cases, and not for all of these new products and so on, but certainly to sort of corner a market in nickel. And it's having very substantial effects on the Indonesian economy, both positive and negative, but it continues to be a major program there. In Pakistan, it's largely about sort of cultivating a security relationship, and a lot of that has to do with mutual issues around India. And both China and Pakistan being worried about India. But it stopped for a lot of the rest of the world, essentially because China ran out of money. As you said, they don't have more money to keep lending on these programs, especially when they don't get paid back. And actually, even before 2022, as early as about 2019, I think it was, the conference in Senegal, where they said, look, there's not a lot more money. Any more programs have to actually be economical. They can't just be extended. But other than just trying to get higher interest rates, or trying to use sort of foreign exchange to reduce, to deleverage away from dollars and U.S. treasuries and this kind of thing. There were two other rationales, and that was part of the rationale, but there were two others, I would say, that are really important that we shouldn't forget. One is that the overall aggregate return on investment in China was awful, and it still is, right? China's overall share of investment in China's economy is way too big. Consumption is very small by comparison to most other developed economies. Right? Exports are very substantial, but not as big as a lot of people think. Investment is huge, way too large, very, very low efficiency investment, low return. And so the idea, as articulated, in fact, by Xi Jinping and others very early on in the Belt and Road process, was to offshore some of this unproductive investment, to move investment out of China into other economies where the risks might be higher, but the return would hopefully also be higher. And so that was one very important logic. The other really important logic was soft power. there was a sense among many people in the Chinese government and beyond, I mean, Chinese academics and others that I've talked to about this, that engaging in sustained, really serious and significant investments in infrastructure, in education and healthcare, in environmental transitions, all of these kind of things across developing countries in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, sort of key countries that with which China wanted to develop positive relationships, would buy some measure of soft power. Now, what's happened though, is that in many of those contexts, the investments did not reap a high return. In fact, they've not been repaid at all, these loans, or they've ended up losing money, right? And then in terms of soft power, it's also sort of boomeranged in that it's a very kind of top-down, ham-fisted way to buy soft power. And fairly quickly, a lot of people in many of the recipient countries of One Belt, One Road started to think more negatively of China. And particularly when it came to this whole idea that's been floated, which I actually don't think was China's strategy at all, of debt trap diplomacy and this kind of thing. I don't think they set out to entrap countries with debt, but people felt entrapped by debt and actually had a very negative view of China rather than a positive view. So if your goal is to cultivate soft power and a positive view of your country in these recipient states and to reap higher returns on investment, and you end up losing money on your investments and people have a more negative view of your country in those places afterwards, you kind of failed on both those levels too.
Although there's one part that might be working a little bit better, and it's being helped by US government policies, which is to push for manufacturers to invest in manufacturing facilities in other countries. So if you look at the stock of industrial investment overseas, that has gone up much more so than infrastructure in the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And actually, they can actually make money by doing that because if it's produced in China, there's a tariff, and there could be a much higher tariff. But if it's a Chinese company producing in Indonesia, in Ethiopia, whatever, doesn't have to pay tariffs.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, the big story of Chinese manufacturing since 2009, I would argue, is in fact offshoring and outsourcing, but offshoring and outsourcing from China to other economies rather than to China from Western economies or whatever we might usually think of. And the other point I would make on that, though, is it's certain countries, not others. So Indonesia actually has not really benefited from that.
Okay.
Vietnam has, Cambodia has, right? A number of other states have around the world. Bangladesh has, Ethiopia, several others that I can't think of right now off the top of my head that have really sort of disproportionately benefited from that. And there are various reasons for that. And we could get into that in the case of specific countries, but I think a lot of that has to do with more politics than economics.
Sure.
Other questions maybe from this side of the room, if there was anybody. Victor and Anna, in that order.
Yep. So I just wanted to ask a quick question. If you read The Economist, there's going to be a lot of talk about like peak China, that China's really hitting the peak. In a couple of years, will go downhill with the economy, with low fertility rates and all of that. What do you make of that peak China idea?
Hi. So my question's quite broad and a bit abstract. So I mostly research on how the UK's economic security and how that sort of interpretation of what economic security means for the UK has been shaped by China's rise and the relationship with China over the past decade or so. And I was wondering what the sort of the other side of the perspective is, like what economic security means for China and especially Chinese state actors, short term and long term as well.
Okay. So, do you want to start with those two?
Oh yeah, peak China. I agree with that argument. Actually, purely economically, right? I think that if the Chinese government were to pursue current policies, which is mainly supply side, it has already, but it will continue to run into a wall of some sort. Because if you think about it, what does it mean to have a wealthy country? People in your country have to be doing well, and right now that is not happening. So there has to be some mechanism such that household level income growth is higher than GDP growth on a sustainable basis. That is not happening. It was happening in China, sort of 20 years ago to 10 years ago. There was a period of very healthy growth where you can see that household income was growing at 15%, sometimes even 20% per year, versus GDP growth of 10% a year. So that was a wonderful period, and it was a period that most people in China still remember today, where people's lives were improving year after year. There were a lot of difficulties, but nonetheless, people could spend a lot more money on food, on things that they enjoy, on tourism, education, etc., etc. That has come to an end recently because of the mix of policies, and unless the Chinese government can reverse that and get it back to a situation where household income is growing faster than GDP, we have reached peak China. On economic security for China, well, it's like the usual thing. I think for some reason the Chinese leadership so that this is the odd thing. Chinese was, we can't be too dependent on foreign companies, foreign enterprises. But guess what? Export is the only engine of growth in China now. So even though the export is done by primarily Chinese companies, is no longer, although I guess Volkswagen is selling Chinese-made Volkswagen in Europe, and so that's causing some kind of problem. So it is mainly Chinese companies doing a lot of the exporting now. China's dependence on foreign markets has actually intensified. And then financial, so sort of insulating the Chinese financial system from the global flow of capital has always been an important component of economic security for China. And there was some hope that they would relax that a little bit when Zhou Xiaochuan was in charge of the central bank. That has come to an end also, just because the threat of capital flight is too high these days, so they can't really. And then finally, China has been, and even more so over time, the leading edge innovators in a lot of industry. So they're starting to want to protect their intellectual property.
Yeah, I'm impressed you managed to work in Zhou Xiaochuan. You always do.
I always do. He's my hero, of course.
Yeah, every time. But what I would say about the peak China thing very quickly, economic security, I think Victor's already said everything that needs to be said on that. But on the peak China idea, yes, I agree with you too, but so does Xi Jinping, right? In the sense that he talks all the time about the new normal, right? And so I don't think anybody believes that we're going to return to an era of 10, 15% per capita GDP growth or GDP growth per year. That's just not going to happen. And that doesn't necessarily mean that China is over or China is done. The question is, as I see it, is this a slow managed decline of growth that doesn't turn negative, right? Because if we look at Japan or Taiwan or South Korea or the UK or the US or any of these countries over their histories, all of them experience a period of 30 to 50 years of incredibly high economic growth and industrialization and transformation of the economy and so on, that then slows down, and slows down both in absolute terms and in terms relative to other countries. Does that mean that peak Britain was in 1914 or 1910? Yes, in many ways. Yeah. And you could talk about the last 110 years of decline. But does that mean that the UK is irrelevant and hopelessly fading from everything? Maybe, maybe not. The US stops growing at that kind of speed around 1970. Does that mean that the US is done 50 years ago? Right? Japan stops growing that way in 1990, 1989, right? Korea, Taiwan around 1997, right? So it's all of these economies that we could point to as sort of the flying geese ahead of the curve in China or near the front of the V, slow down. And now it's just China's turn to slow down, perhaps. So that's one question about it. Does that mean that it's in absolute decline and absolutely over, or is it just going to be slower growth but from a higher base? The second question about it is, For at least the last 15 years, there has been serious talk inside China. I was at a conference in 2010, and someone from what used to be called the State Planning Commission, and now I believe has morphed several times into the National Development and Reform Commission, got up and he said, we can no longer depend on export processing manufacturing. We can no longer depend on the U.S. The U.S. was too big to fail. We've got to kind of bail out the bonds and so on. But now, what we really need is to transition to higher technology, higher value added, higher consumption economy with massive structural reform. And he laid out a very detailed idea of how this would work, a detailed blueprint. A version of that blueprint came out a few years later than that under the Made in China 2025 aegis. Now that got shelved after the trade war began, and it was deemed sort of politically unpalatable, but I think that still animates that basic logic of a structural transformation of the Chinese economy from a lower value-added manufacturing, investment-driven model to a higher value-added, more services-oriented, higher tech, more consumption-oriented model. That transition, that sort of intensive growth rather than extensive growth, and the sort of upgrading of the industrial model has been China's aim for quite a while. And so the big question to me is not, are the aggregate growth rates going to return to what they were 20 years ago? But rather, can China actually make that transformation happen finally, that they've been talking about for 15 years? And if they do, will that crash the economy in the short term? Or will that actually lead to a long-term sustainable, more significant and deeper kind of economic growth and development? If it does, then we're not at peak China. If it doesn't and things crash, then we're definitely past the peak and in the moment before the calamity. But if it doesn't crash and they don't even try the transformation, then maybe we're in this slower managed decline rather than more rapid managed decline or more severe managed decline that I was alluding to before.
I mean, I guess my final word on this is like, yeah, it seems like that kind of thinking by the Chinese government, like thinks of like what might happen tomorrow, but they don't think about what is going to happen the day after tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, right? So basically the plan is like, oh, okay, we have these supply chains for things that people want to buy, EV, solar panels, and stuff like that. If we just systematically get our companies to make all this stuff, then we're going to control these global supply chains, right? And basically, China has been successful, in some of these supply chains, and it's growing dominance, right? So then, once you achieve that, what you need to do. So the problem is like, all that happened because of massive subsidies. So when the government is like, oh, well, we're going to subsidize all this stuff, then not just one company, but like 100 companies will get into this game of trying to get government subsidies to build solar panels, to build batteries. Then you have overcapacity. Then on top of that, you have no profit margin. But guess where government taxes come from? When companies make money. So there has to be profit. And if there's no profit, you have to keep subsidizing these companies. So rather than reaping the fruits, so in a lot of other countries, I mean even Taiwan, right? It's like once the industry start making money, then government coffers starts filling out, and then the social programs got better. I mean, our friend Joe makes arguments. Oh, it's all because of democratization. But like, if the industries hadn't been successful, there wouldn't be the tax basis to pay for all the healthcare,
you could
all that
argue
kind of
that there
stuff.
wouldn't have been democratization either.
Right,
And I don't know if you did call Taiwan another country.
No, I didn't say that. I did not say the region of Taiwan. The region of Taiwan. Yeah, no. You're very bad. The region of Taiwan. So basically, unless you achieve this kind of surplus, which fills the coffer, which allows you to have better social program to support higher levels of welfare and income of the population, the economy is really not going to go anywhere. Even if you dominate these supply chains, all that means is you become even more dependent on export to grow, to have any kind of GDP growth. and that means you can't be mean to other countries because you have to keep trading.
What's quite interesting about that is that it seems very much reminiscent of Japan in the 1980s, or Korea, or Taiwan for that matter, in the 1990s.
Yeah.
Right? And so that there could just be this moment in the course of political economic development at which countries encounter this problem. Right? And so that's one sort of thing to throw out there. The other point I'll just make very quickly, and then we'll come to one last question, is, because I know we're running over time, is that is there any country that can actually think effectively beyond the tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? I'm not sure most countries really engage very effectively in kind of long-term economic planning. And then the other side of that too is that if China's really in this degree of distress over debt and over these other things, if the economy is not going to grow at all if they don't engage in debt spending, then there's no way to collect those corporate taxes that will come later only if the corporations do well. So can they even afford to be thinking beyond today or tomorrow if the risk today is so high of the long-term solutions? If they adopt the long-term solutions, the risk today will be so high.
Yeah.
Last question.
So it's really interesting how high risk taking appetite actually, but also some conservatism in approaches. In the discussion you talked about environmental briefly, but how does this? Is there any relevance to energy transition, to huge global transformation with regard to climate, and let alone nature? But because you're talking about this purely in terms of money and currencies and debt, but I'm not hearing that in terms of climate, and yet it's a very powerful climate state and internationally very powerful as well, and is exerting huge power in the current COP, for example.
So I have this is purely a personal take, which is the Chinese government spend, trillions of dollars subsidizing solar panels, EVs, battery electric technology. The world should benefit from it. We should just buy all this Chinese technology and speed up the transition. I mean, as it is, there's a lot of hiccups, like imperfect infrastructure, people's unwillingness to switch to an EV. But we certainly should not, impede that with tariffs. There's a little bit for EVs. There's a bit of a security issue, because they're like driving computers, so you have to put some safeguards. But that you can use regulations to, make sure that these EVs are not like, absorbing huge amount of data and sending it all to Beijing and so on and so forth. But because of political reasons, the U.S. certainly led by the U.S., but also increasingly Europe, they're trying to protect their traditional car industries, and therefore they have erected tariffs. I think that is very counterproductive from a climate perspective.
So I'm just wondering if some of the precarity that China is in can be stepped through because of this huge economic transformation, economic and social transformation.
Oh, it's not going to help. Right? So even if like tariff goes to zero in the U.S. and Europe, it's still the process of converting to EV is slower in the rest of the world than in China. And the overcapacity is so massive in China that it will still cause a lot of financial issues.
What I would say is this, that, remember, I think that China, I think it's important to remember that China is still, by a good measure, the largest carbon emitter and the largest overall polluter of the global environment. It is also, though, the state that's trying the most, it seems, to do something to address some of these legacy industries, but the method of addressing that is not the method that I think was presumed by a lot of people, say 30 years ago, sitting down to think about the early frameworks of Kyoto and the biodiversity treaties and other things around global emissions around the early 90s and trying to benchmark to 1990 levels and so on. The method of addressing this has been very much industrial policy and very much centered on manufacturing and employment, because that is actually what China's economy needs from the perspective of the government. So yes, there's this overall sort of global social good of reducing emissions. There's also a shifting global institutional framework that will reward industrial development and manufacturing in these sectors and punish it in these others, right? So if you're sitting in China in the 1990s looking ahead, it makes sense from an industrial policy point of view to invest in these new sectors. And it also has all of these positive externalities in terms of actually reducing emissions. So, but I think the emphasis on manufacturing and employment is really key, and that's what's driving the massive growth of capacity to the point where there's overcapacity. And the last thing I would say on that is that technology changes so rapidly in some of these things that it could just be the case that China ends up with massive overcapacity in certain technologies that then will be not so relevant in 5 years or 10 years. And then they'll either have to upgrade again with new round of industrial policy or be left out of the whole global sort of climate competition game, industrial competition around climate game. Any very last points before?
No, just thank you all.
Okay,
for
with
coming.
that, thank you all very much for coming, giving up part of your Friday afternoon, and hope you enjoyed it.